Well, hello, everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kupelman. I'm the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a very engaging and enlightening conversation with Ambassador Nirupama Rao about her new book, which is called The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 1962. Before I forget, I'd like to thank our Wilson Center co-sponsors for this event. Those would be the History and Public Policy Program, as well as the Kissinger Institute for China and the United States, both of whom are partnering with our Asia program for this event today. So Nirupama Rao needs no introduction. She is one of India's most distinguished diplomats. Her 4-decade-long diplomatic career included the posts of Indian ambassador to the US, as well as Indian foreign secretary. She was also India's ambassador to China and the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in those two latter roles, she was the first woman to hold those positions. Following her retirement from public service, she has held several academic appointments, including Mira and Vikram Gandhi Fellow at the India Initiative at Brown University. She also, most importantly, has a long association with the Wilson Center, first as a public policy fellow when she worked on the book that we'll be discussing today, and then as a Wilson Center Global Fellow, which she continues to be now. She's also a member of the Wilson Center Asia Program Advisory Board. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to call Ambassador Rao a colleague. Ambassador Rao, the Wilson Center last hosted an event with you back in June 2020 in this same remote format and on the same topic as today, India-China relations. And I think that this is an indication of how long this pandemic has dragged out and how long we've been doing these remote events. But it's also an indication of how long the issue of India-China relations has been on the front burner in discussions and policy discussions in international relations. So when we did that event featuring you in June 2020, we were discussing the implications of a deadly border clash that had just taken place between India and China in Ladakh. It was the deadliest violence between India and China since their conflict, since their war in 1962. And it plunged relations arguably to their lowest level since that war. Nearly 2 years ago, nearly 2 years later, despite multiple rounds of military dialogue and some troop disengagements, the border spat that triggered the Ladakh clash has not been fully resolved. Now, of course, border disputes are an evergreen theme, in India-China relations. They've been around a long time, including in the early years of the relationship. And your new book, The Fractured Himalaya, is so important and timely because it helps us understand how we got to where we are today. It provides essential context for understanding why there are border disputes today, why they're so long-standing, and what happened in the past that brought us to where we are today. So this is all to say that this should be a great discussion. And so first, let me say to you, Ambassador Rao, welcome back and thanks for participating in this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Absolutely. So I will ask you some questions to start our conversation. And then later on in the hour, I'll take questions from the audience. And for those of you in the audience that would like to pose a question, please email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org or tweet it to @AsiaProgram. So let's get started, Ambassador Rao. You have such a broad array of experience and expertise. You could have written a book on the US-India relationship or the US-China relationship or India's foreign policy, but you chose the India-China relationship in its early years. So my first question to you is the one that I think should begin any book discussion. And that is, why did you decide to write this book? Why India-China, and why this particular time period of 1949 to 1962?
Thank you once again, Michael. It's wonderful to be back at the Wilson Center, and I'm grateful to the center for inviting me for this discussion. Actually, it's the first full-length discussion on my book in the United States. I've had a number of such webinars back here in India, but it's the first involving an audience in the US, really. And this is the book, The Fractured Himalaya. As you can see, it's quite a bulky volume, and took a while in writing, about 4 years in all, with a lot of research into the archives. And I wrote the book because this was a subject that I had dealt with in the Foreign Office for a number of years, from 1984, actually. So I had witnessed the evolution of relations between India and China since then, and had also got acquainted with the history of this relationship, a very intricate, complex, and I would say convoluted history of this relationship, stretching back to the establishment of our two nations, India in 1947 and the People's Republic of China in 1949. And this year, 2022, is going to be 60 years since both our nations fought a brief war in the fall, early winter of 1962. So my view was that with the 60th anniversary coming around, and also because of the events you alluded to just now, the confrontation, the bloody confrontation in the Galwan Valley of Ladakh in June of 2020, which has actually changed the whole tenor and course of the relationship between India and China since those events. I felt that with the renewed interest in the subject of our relations between India and China, it would make a lot of sense, and it would be relevant, and it would resonate if I wrote a book of this nature. Because there's a new generation of Indians, and I presume Chinese, that have grown up since then, and who really haven't had any extensive or deep exposure to what happened in that early period, that formative period of the relationship, which in many ways defines all the issues that concern the bilateral relationship between India and China today, and also cast their shadow across the Indo-Pacific region. So this is a legacy dispute, a 20th century legacy dispute that is still very live today in the 21st century. We're into the third decade of the 21st century, really speaking. And this is a legacy dispute that is still very live. My viewpoint in the book is that of a diplomat practitioner. I'm not a historian by training. I'm not an academic, a professional academic. And I spent all my years, as you mentioned, my professional years was spent in the Foreign Office, really working within the bureaucracy, dealing with day-to-day issues concerning the relationship and the formation of policy towards China. So my viewpoint, I have tackled the subject, perhaps you will see that when you read it, from the viewpoint of a diplomat practitioner. So there is a different cast, perhaps a different nuance to the kind of subjects that I've taken up, the personalities that I've focused on. There's a whole cast of characters in this book, people who were involved in the making of policy, both on the Indian and Chinese side. And one thing that was of great help to me, however, was also not just because I'd handled the subject in the Foreign Office, the records and the archival material that is now available to scholars on this subject is so much more textured, much richer than what we would have encountered or would have dealt with or would have been available to us perhaps 2 or 3 decades ago. So this was of enormous use to me. It became a kind of force multiplier for my work. I was also fortunate to receive a Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship from the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund in Delhi to write the book. And of course, I had the fellowship from the Watson Institute at Brown University. And of course, I was fortunate to be a public policy fellow at Wilson Center in 2017, also, as you know, while working on the book. I think what I had to, the narrative which I cover in my book, as it unfolds, the reader, I think, will be able to connect with a lot of what is happening today in the Indo-Pacific, especially on the continental aspects of our relationship with China, postures towards China, territorial disputes in the region. From all these angles and all these aspects, I believe this is a book which is not just a dry history, it's a kind of living history, and it's in many ways a set of moving pictures, as it were, about this extraordinarily complex relationship. And I call it the fractured Himalaya because for us in India, the Himalaya mountains have been this impenetrable barrier that has in many ways protected us from outside invasion, and from which we have drawn our strength in many ways. Our major rivers flow from the Himalayas. This has been a sacred geography for many in India, a place of pilgrimage, our connections with Tibet. And once the Chinese PLA entered Tibet in 1950, the Himalaya was no longer that impenetrable barrier. In many ways, the strategic challenge, as it were, from China became so much more palpable and real. And that is why I call it the fractured Himalaya, because the Himalaya, that impenetrability of the Himalaya was no longer a given.
So let's get into the book now. One of the main themes is the missed opportunities, or what you appear to describe as missed opportunities for India and China to get their relationship on the right path in these early years that you cover in the book, and of course the missed opportunity to put the two sides in a position where they could avert the war that eventually came. Of course, they were not able to avert the war. And in the very early years of the relationship, there was some reason to be optimism about the relationship. So take us through, in a broad sense, what went wrong. Why did New Delhi and Beijing miss so many opportunities to forge a more stable relationship that could have enabled them to avoid the 1962 war?
Yes. In fact, for India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, the emergence of the People's Republic of China was an event of a great global significance, as I'm sure it must have been to other leaders around the world. But especially for India, which had emerged from colonial domination, which had become a free nation, a large democracy, emphasizing constitutional values and fundamental freedoms. Now, the contrast that was offered by China, be that as it may, it continues to be a communist nation, although the way you define communism differs considerably today from what it was at that time for China in the late 1940s. But the fact was that the emergence of China, which was our largest neighbor as a free and independent country, was seen by leaders like Nehru as an earth-shaking event, and an event which really compelled India to look at this new force on her frontiers with a view to establishing a balance and an equilibrium in relations that would enable both our nations to live, to peacefully coexist with each other, even though the political systems were different, because we needed that peace and we needed that conciliation between these two different systems in order to develop, in order to progress, in order to make our nations stronger. So Nehru viewed the relationship with China from that angle, although he understood the fact that India and China would always pose a challenge to each other. This was never statements, but archives and many private conversations with interlocutors, he would talk about the basic challenge across the spine of Asia being that between India and China, this competition, this difference between India and China, and the fact that, if relations with China, in his view, could be a slippery path, he was aware of that. But the fact was, at that early stage of nationhood, where India was facing enormous challenges in the consolidation of that nationhood, partition had happened, Pakistan, had emerged from undivided India, and the country had been through a lot of upheaval, and there were many tasks at hand to deal with the consolidation, as I said, of nationhood, and dealing with the low levels of economic development, to chart India's progress forward. And therefore, his foreign policy, Nehru's foreign policy, really these conditions dictated that we needed a foreign policy which was going to be an independent third force in world politics, really, neither allied with East or aligned with the West, but an independent force, but which emphasized India's democratic values. Nehru abhorred communism, for instance. But be that as it may, you speak about the missed opportunities. And one has to start on the basic premise that India and China had very little diplomatic dealings with each other. In fact, India had no diplomatic dealings with China prior to that. It was the British Indian government that had dealt with the Chinese. Nehru himself had some contact and communication with the Kuomintang, with Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. They had visited India in the early 1940s, and Chiang Kai-shek had certain views and certain approaches to the whole Indian freedom struggle and how the British needed to bring the Indian freedom fighters on board in the war effort, particularly because, as you know, China was in the throes of conflict with Japan and needed to liberate itself at that point of time. So when the People's Republic emerged, Nehru was one of the first non-communist, Nehru's was one of the first non-communist governments to recognize the People's Republic. But when the Chinese army entered Tibet in 1950, in the winter of 1950, and you know, that military presence, you know, was able to exert complete control, paramountcy over that territory, over the Tibet region, by May, as you know, May 1951, May 23rd, 1951, when the 17-point agreement was signed. At that point, I felt when the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama and his establishment sought to take the case of Tibet to the United Nations, I feel there was an opportunity for India to have been more supportive of that entire effort that the Tibetans had made to bring their case before the UN. And if India had done a little more, perhaps it could have got support, which was, I believe, ready to be given from the UK and the US particularly. So that was one missed opportunity. At least that would have placed Tibet on the agenda, on the agenda of the UN, and flagged the issue for the future, instead of, you know, everybody, all countries just kind of acquiescing in the control that the Chinese now exerted over Tibet. And then in 1954, India gave up all its rights and privileges in Tibet, rights and privileges that it had inherited from Britain. And in exchange for that, India could have, I believe, secured some understanding with China in regard to the common boundary that we shared, or at least come to understand and gauge more clearly what the Chinese attitude was towards this boundary. And that was really not done at that time. It was assumed that the Chinese did not have any differences with India on this border. They had not raised the issue before, and India wrongly assumed that this meant that there would be no boundary problem. And so the advice that Nehru got from officials like Ambassador Panikkar, our first ambassador to the PRC, Ambassador Panikkar, who was himself a historian, he overruled the advice of other very seasoned bureaucrats and public figures like Sir Girija Bajpai, whose advice was that we should raise the question of the boundary with China, because it was so tied up with the question of Tibet. You see, the boundary that India shares with China today is essentially a boundary between India and the Tibet Autonomous Region, and a little stretch of it with the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. So this was what I said was a slippery path that India really went down at that time, a missed opportunity. And then because India had made the strategic error of assuming that the Chinese had not raised the question of the boundary during the Tibet talks in 1954, on the assumption that they really had no differences with India on this subject. That was again a wrong assumption, and it led to another era of commission in many ways, when Nehru decided, after the talks with Tibet on Tibet were over with China, and we had signed an agreement on trade between India and the Tibet region of China. We essentially recognized Tibet as a part of China in that agreement. A few months later, Nehru takes the decision to show the boundaries of India with China, the boundaries on our maps, as fixed and determined. And normally you do that once there are agreements that you've been able to sign. You've come to understandings with the neighboring country concerned about the settlement of these boundaries. I'm not saying that's always the case. There are cases where, in countries show their boundaries in a certain manner on their maps, but ultimately there is always an agreement that is reached so that you have a settlement which enables these boundaries to be peaceful and for not to be disturbed by potential conflict or tensions. And that could not happen because Nehru assumed always that these boundaries were fixed. There was no question of giving up any territory or negotiating any settlement because, this was the boundary, a God-given boundary, a boundary that India would defend, and never mind that it had not been really settled. And that missed opportunity, again, another case of a missed opportunity was in 1960 when Premier Zhou Enlai came to India with a view, with a sort of formula, with a kind of package for a possible settlement. There is very little, I can't say with all certitude that the Chinese were prepared to stick with that package. Their negotiating techniques, all those who have dealt with China are well aware about the fact that they are difficult to negotiate with, that negotiations with the Chinese can be very complex, and you can get ambushed on many occasions. But in any case, the records would suggest that Zhou Enlai came to India with the intention of making an overture which would involve a settlement of the boundary with India. But by then, the whole establishment, the atmosphere, the climate within India, the political climate had hardened so much because there had been incidents on the border. The Dalai Lama had fled to India because of the revolt in Tibet. So the atmosphere was so charged, the public opinion was charged up, parliamentary opinion was charged up, and even within Nehru's cabinet, everybody, the majority, were opposed to any settlement with China. So the lessons that I think we learn from this is, of the need to build a national consensus on these issues, to take the opposition into confidence, because within a democracy, as you know, questions of, and with China too, although it's not a democracy, questions of questions of sovereignty are extremely important, and they've become even more important. But at that nascent stage of national history for both our countries, perhaps there was scope, there was room, there were opportunities for us to settle. And of course, now we have nationalism, everywhere in both our countries, and that has further fanned, I think, the fires of division and conflict.
I think it's so important that you have this book that focuses so prominently on the Tibet issue. I think particularly for readers and audiences in the West, including in the United States, I think that Tibet is an issue that's not well understood in a broader context. I think that it's often looked at through silos, through a human rights approach, or really through the issue of the Dalai Lama, which is obviously something that gets a lot of prominence far beyond the region. But to place the Tibet issue in the proper context of the India-China relationship and how it figured in their struggles to move forward with their relationship and how it fits into border issues and border disputes, it's very important, a very important contribution. So, I wanted to turn a bit to the personalities in the book. I personally, as someone who always enjoys reading history, I enjoy reading about the events, but also about the people that helped shape them. And there are many central figures in this very rich diplomatic history that you produced. You've already talked about Nehru at length, and of course there was Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Those are the big names, but tell us who you believe are the most important, influential political and diplomatic players on both the Indian and Chinese sides in this story, and how they shaped the course of events over the period covered in the book. Who do you think are the key personalities?
Yes, and I just have briefly take a glance at the Tibet issue. As I mentioned earlier, it's very central to the understanding of the problems between India and China. You all know of the McMahon line about the 1914 agreement, the fact that China doesn't recognize that line and India sees that line as sacrosanct because it defines the boundary between India and the Tibet region in the area that we call Arunachal Pradesh. It's the far eastern section of the India-China border. And Tibet is very much a part of the emotional, spiritual, sacred geography of many Indians. It's a place of pilgrimage. There's been a lot of cultural osmosis between India and Tibet. If you look at the geography of the Himalayas, cultural boundaries and linguistic boundaries transcend political boundaries. So that is why Tibet is so important for this story. Not that Tibet was ever a part of India. I mean, nobody is saying that, but I think these ties of pilgrimage, of culture, of language, of religion are so important. Coming to the key political and diplomatic figures in the story, of course, I spoke of Nehru as the central character, a man of many parts, not a Bismarck, not a Kissinger, perhaps not a strategist in that definition of the word, but inspired and driven by his idea of India, a composite, multifaceted, diverse, plural democracy, and his vision of how India and China could at least coexist peacefully. A quintessential Democrat, a global figure, hugely popular in his age, especially within India. And then you had people like his deputy, Sardar Patel, who died, of course, very early on. Sardar Patel died in December 1950, so, very early in our story. But he is also quite iconic in terms of the way his character looms over this narrative, because he's the one who cautioned Nehru when the Chinese entered Tibet about the pitfalls of, assuming that the Chinese could be, pitfalls of unadulterated friendship, let's say, with China because of what happened in Tibet. Patel was strongly anti-communist. Because he had been involved, in the integration of all these states into the Union of India, and he'd witnessed, the communist agitation, for instance, in Telangana, which is, South Central India, and he was strongly anti-communist, and he was very skeptical about the Chinese and their posture and their ideology and their entire, strategy regarding the Himalayas and Tibet. So he emerges as a very important character. Although Nehru and Patel had learned to work with each other, and while he cautioned Nehru about these developments in Tibet, it was not as if Nehru turned a blind eye or a deaf ear to it. And Nehru did take steps very soon after the Chinese entry into Tibet to consolidate Indian administrative presence up until the borders with China, especially in the eastern sector of the border, in what we call, which was the Northeast Frontier Agency, NIFA, which we now call Arunachal Pradesh. So he did take steps. It was in the western sector, what is Ladakh, where we've had all the action, Galwan and other places after summer of 2020. That's where I think the problem really erupted, because the Aksai Chin Plateau in eastern Ladakh doesn't really, is an inhospitable, extremely hostile terrain, doesn't support human life. So it was not possible to really extend administrative presence there. And I think the Chinese took advantage of that opening to developed caravan tracks that had been used by traders in the past to build the Aksai-Chin Highway connecting Xinjiang with Tibet across the Aksai-Chin. And that's how the dispute erupted between India and China when India discovered that road in territory which was shown as Indian on our maps. I'd refer to the decision taken by Nehru soon after the 1954 agreement to show these boundaries as fixed. Then, of course, you had characters, personalities like Sardar Panikkar, Ambassador Panikkar, Sir Girija Bajpai, an extremely astute observer of China, of political, of global affairs, and who understood, I think, who gave advice to Nehru, which if it had been followed, perhaps the outcomes could have been different. And then, of course, on the Chinese side, you had personalities like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The contrast between Zhou Enlai and Nehru, the two key interlocutors from each side in this story, is so palpable when you read the narrative. Both products of very different revolutions. India's freedom struggle was essentially a non-violent revolution, if you could call it. And the whole history of the communist revolution in China, the Civil War, and these were personalities, the Chinese side, that had emerged from that war, a very violent internecine conflict, Chinese against Chinese, and also fighting the Japanese, of course. During the war when the Japanese had invaded China. And then on the Tibetan side, you have personalities like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whose, we see the trajectory of His Holiness's life from his early teenage years. When the Chinese entered Tibet, he was all of 15. The Dalai Lama was all of 15. And you see, he lives in India today. He's in his 80s now, and much of his life has spelt out this connection with India, Tibet's connection with India. The fact that he was witness to all that happened in Tibet from 1950 onwards, and then came to India in 1959, has been here since then, and the whole identity of the Tibetans as a people, cultural, linguistic, religious, has been really kept alive in India since then. Although we don't see the Dalai Lama as a political figure, of course. And then you had Indian bureaucrats like Appa Pant and Harishwar Dayal, who had spent many years in Tibet and in Sikkim and had knowledge of the Himalayan tracts, intimate knowledge. And just to be able to access the archives, the papers of somebody like Appa Pant made writing this book such a pleasure, really, because they wrote so well, and they were able to help you visualize all that happened, especially in regard to policy towards Tibet, how Tibet really became, as one Englishman said, the Cinderella of not only the British Foreign Office, but also the Indian Foreign Office. So my book has a whole list of dramatis personae, as it were, because this was quite a dramatic period in relations between India and China.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that. And indeed, you mentioned the Dalai Lama as a fascinating character in himself. There are a few questions from the audience about him, so I may come back to him in a bit. But let's take a step back from the book, and I wanted to ask you a question about your research, which I'm sure you remember doing some years ago for this book. What would you say struck you or surprised you the most in the course of your research? Do you remember, was there something that you came across when you were going through archives, or was there a document or a quote or a letter or something which made you say, well, that's not something that I expected to see, or that's really changed the way that I was thinking about this? So it'd be curious for us to hear, if there was something that really struck you in particular in the course of all of the extensive research you did for this book in recent years.
Yes, as I mentioned, Michael, the material that I was able to research from was enormously rich. I had the Nehru papers, There were lots of private papers of bureaucrats. Then, of course, the Chinese archives, which were not really open in many senses, but I'm thankful to the Wilson Center for your Cold War history project that has helped translate so much of the Foreign Office archives that had become available for a very short period from 2007, I think, to 2010 or so. In the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So those translations, and you had oral histories of a number of diplomats on the Indian side. You had the Krishna Menon papers. Krishna Menon, you know, was defense minister during the war with China in 1962. He was very closely associated with Nehru. And just to be able to delve into this very complex relationship between these two very historic personalities, I think was quite revelatory. And Krishna Menon's negotiations with Chen Yi, who was the foreign minister of China just before the war of 1962, held in Geneva. They had discussions in Geneva in 1961, and some of the revelations that emerged from the papers that I was able to consult, both on the Indian side, the Krishna Menon papers, and also the Chinese archives, did indicate that both countries did make some effort just before everything, went downhill and we had the conflict. They did make efforts to arrive at some peaceful settlement. We really don't know what the formula was, but there are some hints that Krishna Menon did come up with a few suggestions about how we might settle the problem. The Chinese were skeptical, but they didn't rule it out completely. But everything essentially fell by the wayside because the atmosphere on both sides, I think, was becoming very, very charged. Towards the end of 1961 and 1962 onwards, things really deteriorated further. So this whole experience through studying the archives of windows opening and closing, I think that was quite fascinating because you don't see much of that happening today, and which is what makes this period so fascinating to study, because we were still, nations in a very formative state, I think. As I mentioned earlier, the opportunities were there for us to settle and take a more long-term perspective of this relationship, and which is what makes it, in some senses, very poignant also.
Great, thank you for that. So let's now shift forward a bit to the present. At the Wilson Center, we're always looking at how past history can help inform thinking about public policy in the present. So many are trying to do that. So you alluded to this at the beginning in your very first comments, but I think it would be great to hear some thoughts from you in terms of what this very complex early period in India-China relations can teach us about where the relationship stands today at a moment when I think we could agree is arguably tenser than it's been at any time in decades, perhaps since the war in 1962. So what are a few of the lessons for the present that you think could be drawn from this rich but difficult history that you lay out in your book?
Well, as I said earlier, Michael, the dispute that India and China are faced with today on their common boundary, which is, about 3,500 kilometers long. And I know you need to convert that into miles for our American friends, but the dispute has its origin in the 1950s. And it's very, very important that we understand the evolution of those differences if we are to tackle the nature of the dispute today. In many senses, also, studying that period tells you how the language of Chinese diplomacy has not really changed very much. If you study the white papers that India put out on the dispute and read the diplomatic notes and the aid memoirs, and you see that the language, the syntax, the phraseology, the tone hasn't really changed very much. And despite China's opening up and reform over the last 4 decades and the fact that it's such a different country today. It's a world power. But in many ways, I think that straitjacket, that communist straitjacket when it comes to diplomatic handling and diplomatic dealings, just how they approach the whole issue of diplomacy is still, quite stilted. The stock phrases persist. The methods of functioning in the Chinese Foreign Office have not really changed. As Zhou Enlai told their mandarins in the early 50s, diplomats are soldiers in civilian uniforms. They're really PLA soldiers in civilian uniforms. That's, I think, a quote that I came across the other day. And China's view of India, from that early period as India being some kind of a halfway house, the way they looked at India's democracy and open society, I don't think they approached the issue of relations with China the way Nehru and much of the Indian government did at that time. I think we were much more open-minded when it came to building that relationship. And the Chinese, in a sense, were more opportunistic and perhaps more time-serving when it came to the relationship, and very materialistic, I would say, in wreaking as much advantage as they could, because China, in many ways, was presented on the global stage by India. If you study the history of Bandung, for instance, the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference. And China's ambition to be a leader among nations comes through even when you study the history of the period that I have written about. The dreams of restoring Chinese greatness even then. And I don't think they looked at India in the same bracket, even at that time. They wanted to outmaneuver us, outdo us, outshine us, even at that stage. So, the outlook towards the region, to the neighborhood, many of the, all that germinated during this period. And Zhou Enlai, as you know, is still seen as the patron saint of Chinese diplomats even today. So the methods and the approaches, I think, are very relevant to studying China even today when you look at what happened in that period. And what is happening in Ladakh today, the whole problem across the line of actual control. You have to study this period to understand the nature of the dispute in Ladakh particularly, and also the nature of the dispute between India and China in the east, in Arunachal Pradesh, the whole history of the Matmayan line. So, the genesis of all these problems lies in the years before 1962. What is happening in Ladakh today, what is happening in Arunachal Pradesh, and during the war of 1962, the conflict, the way how the Soviet Union and the Chinese, the whole interplay between China and the Soviet Union. Our own, outreach to the United States at that time. So this is history, as I said, it's living history even today. It's not history that is dry as dust. It's something that we need to absorb into the mainstream of the relations that we seek to transact today.
Thanks for that. And that sort of takes me into what will be my final question before we take audience questions. So my apologies for asking to be a bit speculative, but if you wanted to identify some things that we might want to watch for in the future, some signpost, if you will, that could help us better predict or give us an indication of what direction the India-China relationship is going, drawing on your work that you did for this book. And do you think there are any scenarios under which we could see another war between India and China?
Well, when you really look at what the future of India-China relations could be, I think the first characteristic that you have to recognize is that the tensions between the two are very palpable today, particularly after what happened at Galwan in June of 2020 and the whole standoff across the line of actual control. The second point is there's a total absence of mutual trust between the two countries. Thirdly, you have a highly militarized border troops, accumulation of troops from both sides. This is highly militarized. Just think of, conditions now. This is February. Winter in those areas, temperatures can go down to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Again, convert that into Fahrenheit, you can imagine how cold and how forbidding and how hostile the climate is. And yet, both our countries are engaged in the defense of our sovereignty across one of the most hostile mountain tracts in the world. Then you see the whole role of China in South Asia and in our neighborhood, the inroads that China has made with the Belt and Road Initiative and with its diplomatic outreach, and many, perhaps in some ways, some arm twisting also involved in some of our neighborhood. And of course, the whole relationship with Pakistan that has become much more developed and much more of a strategic challenge, let us say, to India than it was ever before. Both Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi are leaders that emphasize strong control, centralized functioning. They're both, you're dealing with two very starkly nationalistic nations today, and both seek power and influence in the region. And of course, China, in many ways, is 3 times larger than India if you look at development indices and economic growth, for instance, and military power. But I'm talking of, national outlook here from each country. I mentioned the China-Pakistan factor, which makes the whole situation along our borders a 2-front challenge today, all across, the Ladakh frontier and also the line of control in Kashmir. So the potential for conflict is so much greater today when you look at the future, because as I said, there's no trust between India and China. There is this whole complex history of this relationship along the border, and the clash of power and ambition on the part of both. The evolution of India's Indo-Pacific policy is also something that you have to focus on for the future, especially after the outbreak of tensions between India and China, the growth of the Quad, the new efforts that India is making to balance China externally. The diplomatic arena is very much open today, and the India-US comprehensive strategic global partnership has become extremely the most vital, most crucial relationship for India as far as our foreign policy is concerned. With Russia is another key relationship, a key foreign policy relationship for India. It's an old relationship, a time-tested relationship. The channels have been kept open. Not only because we import a great deal of defense equipment from China, but also I think the China-Russia factor entails that we need to keep that communication channel open with Russia. And that provides for some balance in that situation too. Meeting the China challenge in our neighborhood is always, I think, an ongoing task. It's something that occupies policymakers in Delhi constantly. And but all the same, the relationship that we have with China today, especially when it comes to trade, is huge. And over the years that, that those connections have grown so intricate, so much so that even after the tensions broke out in the summer of 2020, that trade relationship is not very easy to extricate oneself from, especially the imbalances in this relationship. We import so much from China, and that those imports, in fact, have grown during these pandemic years. And that, I think, is a challenge for our policymakers in New Delhi, the way how we are to extricate ourselves from that, how we are to decouple in many ways, how we are to build more efficient, more resilient supply chains, how we are to provide for the technological inputs, the manufacturing technologies that we need to build more self-reliance, which is a huge, hugely important policy goal that the Modi government has set for itself. Something like Xi Jinping's dual circulation policy, although China wants the rest of the world to depend on China more and more. and for China to depend less and less on the outside world. That is a little different from how we see self-reliance in India. We don't want to cut our ties with the rest of the world, but we want to be able to build a more resilient industrial and business and commercial capabilities within India to promote our own development and sustenance.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad you made that point there about trade. And indeed, soon after the Galwan clash, the government had indicated that it wanted to cut back on this critical commercial relationship. And yet, we heard the trade volume figures at the end of last year. There's still some pretty robust figures there. So I think that's an important point about how difficult it will be to this notion of moving away from China commercially. So the time we have left, I wanted to pose a few audience questions. And the first, you had mentioned before this idea of a legacy dispute between the two sides. You use that term legacy a lot. So there are two legacy related queries that I'll pose to you, and I'll pose them, the two questions together. One was from Yves Tibergian, a professor. How do we assess the legacies of the Simla Convention today, and how can we go beyond this framework of contention? That, of course, is something that predates the period that you studied. You may want to briefly lay out what that convention was. I could do it, but it's better that you do it. The second question comes from Michael Yehuda, George Washington University. What is the legacy of the British Raj in the Himalayas? Pretty interesting, tough questions, but if you wanted to briefly offer some thoughts on those two legacy-related questions, I think that would be really interesting for our audience.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe I should tackle both these questions together. As far as the Simla Convention of 1914 was concerned, that was the convention that not only defined Britain's rights and privileges, or at least opened the door to defining Britain's rights and privileges in Tibet, and opened a new chapter in interactions with Tibet, a period when the Chinese attempts to control Tibet and Tibetans was really weak and hardly expressed because of internal difficulties within China to begin with. And this was a period also when the Simla Convention witnessed the definition of the border between the Assam tribal areas, as they were called, and the Tibet region, the Tibet and Tibet at that time, across the Himalayas, across the high watershed of the Himalayas. And that was the genesis of the McMahon Line, which essentially, till this day, defines the boundary in this sector between what is today Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet. Now, the Chinese have never recognized the McMahon Line, and they call it an illegal line because they have always disputed the right or the capability, or maybe it's essentially the right of Tibet to sign independent agreements with foreign governments, which was said this was essentially an Indo-Tibetan agreement, which formalized the McMahon Line in 1914. Independent India took on that aspect of what we had inherited from the British and defined our boundary with Tibet in this sector on the basis of that McMahon Line. Nehru said, the McMahon Line is our boundary, map or no map. That's what he said, way back in 1950. And that has continued to be the Indian line, regardless of changes in government or, the passage of years. So that really, unfortunately, in 1954, as I said, when India essentially gave up all the rights and privileges defined under the Simla Convention between India and Tibet, and we essentially took the decision slightly before that to convert our political office in Lhasa into a consulate. We essentially gave up the privileges that we had, and we ultimately culminated in the recognition of Tibet as a region of China, which was what the 1954 agreement spoke of. But that was the time, that was the opening then for us to have understood and to to have proceeded on the central principle that if we were discussing rights and privileges that we were going to be giving up with Tibet, it was very, very essential to keep the focus also on seeking from the Chinese validation of the McMahon Line, because both these came together. The 1914 convention covered, at least for India, both these aspects. And to look at one without the other, I think was a costly proposition for us, as things were proved in the years that followed. The legacy of the British Raj in the Himalayas, what can I say? I mean, well, you can argue that the way we defined our boundaries in one way was influenced by how a lot of British geographers looked at the Himalayan watershed between Tibet and Xinjiang and our own territories. That's one way. Our connections with Nepal, with Bhutan, with Tibet. I mean, the history of British dealings with these regions definitely was one aspect of how we looked at these regions, but not entirely. I would beg to differ on that, because there were historical connections, people-to-people connections, cultural connections, and linkages that India had with these regions much before the British advent and the beginning of British imperial rule in India. I think the people of the Himalayas have, in some senses, have had to deal with the fallout of the dispute between India and China in the border areas. And along this long border, I spoke of, the length of that border. And I think in these borderlands, as it has come to be, as we have defined sovereignties and borders have been closed and passes no longer function as conduits of trade, and lines of actual control have become heavily militarized. I think that whole experience, that popular experience of what history had meant for this region, these close contacts, the exchange of trade, of goods, of pilgrimage, of people moving across borders, of shared linguistic and cultural heritage, all that we have lost out on.
Well, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Our hour's almost up, but I wanted to ask you two more questions, which I'll group together. Staying on the issue of Tibet, but this is looking at more in the future. The first one is from Jaya Lila at the Stimson Center, and her question is, what are the implications for Sino-Indian relations once the Dalai Lama dies? And then the second question from Siddhant Hira at King's College London, what situation or event would force India to take on the Chinese Red Line of Tibet through either and or a combination of military, political, economic, social, or human rights means? So we wanted to address those two queries.
I think in some senses, the train has left the station because when it comes to Tibet, India recognizes Tibet as a part of China today. For that matter, every country in the world essentially acknowledges that, recognizes that, even if they don't say that in so many words. So that is, perhaps a tragic way of putting it. So much has been lost in the process for Tibet and Tibetans particularly. I think the presence of the Dalai Lama in India is hugely important for Indians who respect him deeply, and for the Tibetan people, because as I said, that whole flame of Tibetan identity, of the cultural and religious and spiritual heritage of the Tibetans lives on in India, in Dharamshala, where the Dalai Lama is located, as you know. We don't know how the question of his succession is going to pan out. This is something that will occupy the attention of countries across the globe, I'm sure. We hope he lives as long as possible. The Chinese will want to have the last say and the last word on this. I mean, this whole question of succession and how the next Dalai Lama is going to be chosen. If we had to go by the history of what happened when the Panchen Lama died in 1989 and his successor was to be chosen, it was very, very complicated and extremely tangled history, if you look at it. And this issue of who will be the legitimate candidate, I think, is going to be the question. The Chinese will put forward their own candidate and say that he or she is the legitimate candidate. And I'm sure the Tibetan community across the world and, people who practice Tibetan Buddhism and senior members of the Tibetan clergy who live in exile abroad, they will have their own views. So this is going to be, I'm sure, a complicated issue. It's going to be quite disputed, something on which there will be huge areas of difference between the two sides. To what extent India can influence this process, I really can't say. I think the fact is that we have a hugely sensitive relationship with China. And the whole factor of military tension, very palpable at the moment. The need to provide for disengagement, to provide for de-escalation, to provide for a reduction of tensions is very important, I think, for both countries. We live at this moment in a state of great flux and uncertainty in the relationship. That's all I can say.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, our hour is flown by, so we'll need to wrap up in just a moment. But can't help but asking if, as we close, there is a question from someone asking if there's been any reaction in China to your book. And also, several of the folks that have reviewed your book have asked in their reviews if there could be a sequel coming. And I myself am wondering that. So if you want to just very briefly say if you have any plans for a sequel, and also if you've heard of any reactions from the book in China.
Well, I haven't heard of any reactions from my book in China. I'm sure that, it has come to the notice of the Chinese. I know that the Chinese embassy in India is aware of the book. And I'm sure, there's a whole body of scholars in China who study India very closely, and I'm sure they're aware of the book. But I haven't really had any opportunity to interact with, these scholars about the book after it came out. Maybe in the future, let us see. They can't be too happy, I'm sure, about the fact that I deal with this issue of Tibet in so much detail in the book. And I've tried to deal with it in a very empathetic fashion, partly because of my own empathy for the Tibetan people. But that's the way it is. As far as the sequel is concerned, yes, I'm being urged by a lot of people to write a sequel. I might consider it. I can't say categorically at the moment, but yes, yeah, my publishers are also interested in my doing a sequel. Let's see.
Well, I know that many of us would really love to see one if it happens. So this has been such a great discussion, as expected. We've learned so much. For those of you in the audience in the US, you can get the book through Amazon, I believe, Fractured Himalaya. It really is a great read. Despite its length, it's a quite breezy read. It's not a quick read because of the length, but it's breezy. It's very engrossing. So incredibly important, particularly given what's going on with the relationship now. So thank you again, Ambassador Rao, for this conversation. And thank you all in the audience for tuning in. And I wish everyone good health and a good day and a good night. So with that, we will adjourn.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.